Thanks everybody for coming out for our talk today. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, the WCED. And we are extremely delighted today to have Fiona Shen-Bayh returning to the fold, if albeit virtually. Many of you know Fiona from when she was at WCED in 2018, 2019 as one of our postdoctoral fellows. She, unfortunately for us, had to leave us a year early, but fortunately for her, she's got a terrific position now. She's an assistant professor of government and data science at William & Mary, as well as an affiliated researcher at the University of Bergen. Fiona earned her PhD and her MA in political science from the University of California at Berkeley, and her BA in economics from Vassar College. And as we'll be hearing more about today, her research focuses on the role that law and courts play in defending and upholding autocratic rule. And we'll be hearing more about her current book project, which examines why autocrats use courts to repress and the ramifications of such strategies on autocratic survival in the global South. So we're delighted to be able to bring Fiona back to talk about her research, see how the book project has been coming along. You had the instructions up earlier about Q&A, so feel free to write questions in the Q&A throughout the talk if people so wish. We've got 36 participants, so we've got a good crowd. So feel free to send questions in and I'll curate those at the end of Fiona's talk. So without any further ado, Fiona, thanks for coming back. Great to see you and looking forward to hearing your talk.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is personally very rewarding to be able to come back to the Weiser Center and present this work. This is a project which originally I started writing while I was a postdoc at the Weiser Center. So it's kind of like it's coming full circle to be able to come back to you today and present the progress that I've made on the book project. So I'm just gonna see if I can share the screen. And all right, pull up. All right. So assuming you can see the presentation on your main screen. Well, so today I'm presenting some excerpts from my book project, which is titled Undue Process, Persecution and Punishment in Autocratic Courts. And in this project, I have two broad motivating questions. And the first is, what role do courts actually play in strategies of repression? And then secondly, what are the disciplinary dimensions of autocracy? So specifically, how is the process of punishment actually institutionalized? And part of what motivated this broader research agenda was this trend that I saw in a lot of contemporary reporting on autocratic regimes, right? So there seems to be this legalization of autocratic rule, where autocrats in a variety of contexts around the world are increasingly turning to, legal and judicial procedures to actually fortify and consolidate their rule. And so a lot of these prosecutions have actually been characterized as persecution through prosecution. So that's a moniker that was actually created by Amnesty International to refer to some of the treason trials that have occurred in Zambia in recent years. So even though there's a lot of media fanfare about recent cases, I think that one of the main takeaways from the book project is that there are actually long-standing historical legacies that sort of feed into the modern trends that we're seeing, right? So really revisiting this notion of whether using legal and judicial procedures for autocratic ends is a modern phenomenon or instead a long-standing legacy that goes back much farther in history, right? So this is just a finding from the Varieties of Democracy Institute survey, wherein they show that around the world, autocratic regimes have long invoked rational legal ideals as the basis of their legitimacy. So with this backdrop in mind, the book is motivated by three main questions. And the first being, what is the function of a political trial in an autocratic regime? The second question is, why do autocrats judicialize punishment when extrajudicial repression is often more efficient and direct? And then third, how do autocrats actually ensure, once they decide to use the courts for these repressive purposes, that the judiciary is actually going to cooperate with their repressive agenda? To answer these questions, I develop something which I refer to as a judicial strategy of repression. And this is really the theoretical framework of the book. And with the judicial strategy of repression, I argue that a political trial institutionalizes the process of punishment. And in so doing, it helps reinforce the rules of political order. And so this is really important towards stabilizing and consolidating autocratic rule. I also argue that this strategy is more useful when autocrats face threats to regime cohesion, right? So specifically what they need to do is they need to invoke a judicial process to restore obedience to their authority. And then finally, I argue that in order to ensure everything goes to plan, professionalizing the bench is actually a really great way for autocrats to help institutionalize the judicial process. But I find that in so doing, autocrats, they face a trade-off, right? So professionalizing the bench can actually make the judiciary less cooperative with the autocrats' agenda. And I'll sort of unpack these trends a little bit later on in the talk. But this is a preview of the theoretical framework for the remainder of the book. And so just to provide a brief outline of where I'm going in this talk, I'm going to first discuss the puzzle of political trials. Then I'm going to lay out my theory, a judicial strategy of repression. Then I'm going to provide some of the evidence from the manuscript. So specifically, I'm going to walk you through a judicial ritual in the Kenyan case. And then I'm going to provide some quantitative analysis that unpacks who is more likely to go to trial in autocratic regimes. And then I'm going to close with contributions and sort of broader takeaways from this project. So the puzzle of political trials, why do autocrats actually judicialize conflict in the first place? So I think it's helpful to open with this definition of political trials from Judith Shklar. It's something that helped ground my analysis in this work. So she wrote in Legalism, what after all is a political trial? It's a trial in which the prosecuting party, usually the regime in power, aided by a cooperative judiciary, tries to eliminate its political enemies. And I really like this definition because it lays out, the main actors involved, and it also lays out, what is the ultimate objective of this proceeding. But so in the same book, in the same text, Shklar notes that judicial purges amount to no more than frosting on the cake of perpetual purges. So this actually begs the question, if this is really just frosting on the cake, what's the purpose of having this frosting, right? You can still have the cake and eat it without having all this, pomp and circumstance of a trial. So this is really where the book is making a contribution, trying to answer this question, is what is the purpose of this proceeding, especially if we think, it's kind of just icing on the cake. So in looking at the existing theoretical approaches to explaining the phenomena of political trials, I think it's helpful to think of these things as in two camps. The first being concealment theories. So here, a lot of scholars have shown, that judicial institutions, they're really just window dressing that ultimately conceal the true nature of repression. So there's a lot of work that looks at this, especially a lot of recent work on democratic backsliding, highlighting the concealment power of the judiciary. But if that's the case, it's really not clear whether or not this is concealing anything, right? So the opening example I showed you of, persecution through prosecution, that's a phrase that was created by the international human rights community because they recognize these are really trumped up treason trials, right? They are political purges by judicial means. So concealment theories can't really address the fact that a lot of audiences don't really take these cases seriously. So another body of work focuses on theories of coordination, right? So courts in this framework actually help maintain elite cohesion because they make autocrats tie their own hands. So there's a lot of work looking at autocratic courts as these institutions that constrain autocrats in meaningful ways. And this is part of a broader intellectual tradition looking at autocratic institutions, whereby institutions are vital towards establishing credible commitments and elite power sharing, which ultimately feeds into autocratic stability. So these theories of autocratic institutions, they primarily focus on concessionary measures, right? So specifically, autocrats create institutions because they are trying to co-opt elites and essentially buy their support. And so a lot of work, focuses on, how these dynamics play out in parties and legislatures and bureaucracies, constitutions, and just basically looking at how autocratic rule becomes institutionalized. But maintaining elite cohesion is ultimately about more than just concessions, right? It also involves imposing consequences for violating the rules. But the reality is the disciplinary dimensions of autocracy, especially the way in which discipline can be institutionalized in the law and the courts, this remains relatively under-theorized vis-a-vis this broader literature on autocratic institutions. So this leads to my theoretical framework, which I again refer to as a judicial strategy of repression. So with the judicial strategy, I'm going to argue three separate steps. First, a political trial can institutionalize punishment and restore obedience to authority. I'm going to also argue that this strategy is more useful when autocrats face threats to regime cohesion. And specifically, I'll show how the dynamics of insider versus outsider threats lead to different outcomes along judicial and extrajudicial repressive strategies. And then finally, I'm going to argue that judicial punishment goes hand in hand with professionalizing the bench, but I also argue that doing so raises this risk of judicial noncompliance, which autocrats ultimately have to confront. And I also argue that in order to ensure the judiciary does cooperate, there are a variety of ex ante and ex post controls that autocrats can impose. So let's revisit this notion of a political trial, right? Building off of Judith Shklar's definition. So in the book, I think of a political trial as a formal ceremony that is specifically invoking the language of the law and the procedures of court to adjudicate whether the rules of order have been violated. And so the thing about the political trial is that it adheres to a set sequence of motions, right? Every trial proceeds in the same way: accusation, prosecution, verdict. And so because it is adhering to this set sequence every time the judicial process is invoked, this is an institutionalized performance, right? It's predictable, it's familiar, and it's ultimately routine. And from beginning to end, this process ultimately constitutes what I refer to as a judicial ritual. So what's the purpose of a judicial ritual? What are we trying to get with the ceremony of justice? The purpose of a ritual is ultimately to tell a simple story. And in this case, with the political trial, the story is, if you defy the rules of political order, there are consequences to doing so. And the way that this story is conveyed is through the language of the law. And what's useful about this language is that it translates the messy reality of conflict into a very simple black and white story of right and wrong, right? You either transgressed the law or you abided by it. And by conveying this legal narrative over the course of a ritualized trial, the judicial proceeding is able to draw an explicit connection between crimes and consequences. So, the follow-up question is, why do we actually have to perform this ritual in a court of law? Why is the setting actually important? And I argue that the court is really a staging ground for autocrats to establish common knowledge about the rules of political order. And for the observers of court, right, every audience member is able to absorb information about the trial, but also they're able to observe how the trial is received by others, right? This information is being relayed in real time. And so everyone's able to observe the trial and observe each other. So, if you are a member of this audience and you're watching this proceeding unfold and you're watching others accept the trial as true, this act of observation can actually generate beliefs that others support the autocrats' rules, right? And if you believe that others believe that what you're seeing is true, this can actually help reinforce the message of the trial because beliefs are stronger when they're shared. When do autocrats invoke a judicial process? So I argue that they invoke a judicial process, or they're more likely to do so when regime cohesion is under strain. And so under these conditions, autocrats need to really shore up support for their authority, right? They need to remind everyone what the rules of political order actually are. And different rivals to power ultimately pose different threats to regime cohesion. So insider rivals, these are elite members of the ruling group. They pose a greater threat to regime cohesion. And so I argue that's why they get a judicial process. Outsider rivals, they are elite members of the opposition. They pose a lower threat to regime cohesion, at least lower vis-a-vis an insider threat. And so that's why they are more likely to be subject to an extrajudicial process. So I'm going to flesh out what I mean by insider and outsider over the next 2 slides. So insider rivals, right? These are the greatest threats to regime cohesion an autocrat can face. So insider elites can undermine regimes from within, right? So their proximity to power is what makes them a heightened threat to autocratic survival. And so the part of what insiders rely on is the fact that they can plot in secret against the autocrat. But it's the secrecy of the secret nature of insider rebellion, which makes an autocrat more uncertain about the scope of the conspiracy, right? So if everyone within the ruling group is pretending to be loyal in public, but maybe they're plotting in private, the autocrat may be uncertain of who is a true friend or foe. This is in contrast to outsider rivals, who are relatively lower threats to regime cohesion. So outsider elites are more peripheral to power than insiders. And so as such, because they lack access to the privileges of power, they have to mobilize in other ways, and usually mobilizing in mass, like a broad-based popular support. And so because outsiders are more likely to operate outside and in the open, autocrats are ultimately more certain about the scope of that threat. Right, so opposition is out in the open in contrast to insider opposition, which is more covert and potentially concealed. And so with this logic in mind, this is how the logic of judicial and extrajudicial repression unfolds. So we have 2 different types of threat, insiders versus outsiders. Insider threats pose a covert threat from within. Outsiders pose an overt threat from without. And so as such, insiders are going to pose a greater threat to regime cohesion, whereas outsiders are going to pose a lesser threat to regime cohesion. And then that's going to lead to a judicial strategy with respect to insiders and an extrajudicial strategy with respect to outsiders. All right, so assuming that autocrats have these intentions of using political trials and they're going to use them against insiders, they actually have to figure out how to make sure the judiciary cooperates with this agenda. But autocrats face an important dilemma of judicial design. Professionalizing the judiciary actually goes hand in hand with institutionalizing the process of punishment, right? If your judges are professionals who understand the law and know how to conduct the court in a ritualized, routinized way, that goes hand in hand with stabilizing and routinizing the process of punishment in court. But when you professionalize the judiciary, this actually imposes an important constraint on the ability of autocrats to arbitrarily pack the bench with their cronies, right? So it's a harder sell for a dictator to just put their cousin or their brother in as chief justice, unless their brother or cousin happens to have, a legal degree. This is not to say that those 2 things can't be overlapping, but there are important supply side constraints on the ability of autocrats to actually arbitrarily fill the bench or populate the courts with their preferred agents. The challenge for autocrats under these constraints is they have to have a steady supply of jurists who are both qualified professionals and regime loyalists. When an autocrat compromises on either criterion, right? So if they compromise on professionalization or they compromise on loyalty, they ultimately raise the risk of judicial compliance or judicial non-compliance. And later in the talk, I'll provide a little bit of evidence that sort of gets at this broader phenomenon. But I deal with this more in the book, and I'm happy to talk about it during Q&A if people have questions. So now I want to move on to a case study, and I want to sort of walk you through the process of a judicial ritual in Kenya to sort of to flesh out the mechanisms that I'm highlighting in this theory. So just to provide a little bit of background on the Kenyan case. So Kenya achieves independence in 1963 under the leadership of Jomo Kenyatta, right? So here this is a picture of him being sworn in by the Chief Justice, Sir John Ainley, who at the time, as you can see, was a white Englishman, and more on that later. But long story short, he rides to power through this party apparatus, and the task facing him at independence is consolidating his authority over the party and the state. So just to summarize the main features of a judicial ritual in this Kenyan case, as Kenya emerges as a one-party state in the post-colonial period, President Kenyatta faced threats to power both within and without the ruling party. When he faced threats from within, a political trial ultimately helped him institutionalize the process of punishment when regime cohesion was under strain. And the outcome of the trial ultimately helped restore order and obedience to the president. And so now I'll walk through some of these details. So the rise of the one-party state in post-colonial Kenya, in the early years, it was about consolidating power underneath the Kenya African National Union, so KANU. So Jomo Kenyatta articulated the logic of one-party rule in this treatise that he published in 1964 called Toward a One-Party System. And so he argues we have a twofold job to do: to secure our people from the aggression of our enemies and subversion originating from some of our self-appointed friends, both within and without. And so here we actually see Jomo Kenyatta on the right sitting next to Oginga Odinga, who was his vice president, and factionalism within the ruling party ultimately led to a party split, the creation of an opposition. And so this was the type of scenario that Kenyatta was really trying to prevent, right? Doesn't want opposition to emerge and challenge his one-party supremacy. And so once the opposition formed under Odinga, so the opposition party posed an overt collective threat to Kenyatta and other insiders, and they were very routinely extrajudicially repressed. So this is actually a clipping from the Sunday Nation. It was a local Kenyan newspaper, but basically a lot of extrajudicial harassment was used to severely undercut and undermine the opposition. So they were detained without trial, they were denied the right to mobilize, they were denied the right to stand in elections, and this effectively eviscerated the threat posed by the opposition, who the regime was very willing and able to characterize as a subversive, in some cases terrorist organization. So that was how they really dealt with a lot of opposition threats. But when it came to factionalism that remained within the ruling party, these were a bit more covert, divisive, and controversial. So viable successors to Kenyatta were emerging within the ruling party, right? And so for Kenyatta and the Kikuyu leadership, they were concerned that confidence in his rule was slipping. Right, so people were becoming more and more vocal against the authority and the legitimacy of Kenyatta. And this led to a series of purges and assassinations. But this violence, extrajudicial violence against members of the regime, provoked incredible backlash, right? And so it was leading to a lot of speculation that the leader on top was losing his grip. Right, so this is another clipping from the East African Standard from March 1971, where they're highlighting the fact that the ruling party, KANU, is in chaos. And so specifically they say, as things stand today, KANU is virtually dead. Numerous complaints are voiced by MPs and by the public that KANU is only remembered during the times of elections, and when elections are over, KANU is thrown into a wastepaper basket. So I want you to remember the date on this newspaper clipping, March 19th, 1971, because things are about to dramatically turn, right? The fate of KANU is about to turn on its head. So in June 1971, right, amidst this crisis and these rumors about KANU sort of caving in on itself, the government makes an announcement that it has actually foiled a plot to overthrow the ruling party and assassinate President Kenyatta. And the plotters are actually going to be tried for sedition, right? So this was actually a surprising move at the time. And a lot of commentators were curious about why the regime was going to hold this trial when the ruling party had already effectively used extrajudicial repression to eliminate opposition forces, right? So they had on this book a preventive detention law that would have totally entitled them. It would have been totally legal to just detain these people. So why were they actually going to trial? So part of what happened over the course of this trial is that the regime performed a judicial ritual, right? It was a very simple story of doomed rebellion. And in this story, they dragged the indictees to court, right? So here is Gideon Mutiso. He was a member of KANU who was charged as one of the leading conspirators. So here he is standing before the court. Essentially what they did was they ritualistically humiliated Mutiso and other members who were accused of this plot for their role in the conspiracy. And over the course of the trial, the main takeaway from observers of court was that, wow, this was a foolhardy attempt to unseat the dictator, and it obviously failed, right? And so Mutiso himself was, it was remarked that when he delivered his testimony on the stand, right, he was crying, he was begging for forgiveness from Jomo Kenyatta, and a lot of people, their takeaway from this was Kenyatta's rules had been defied, and the consequences of doing so were that Mutiso would obviously be punished. And as the trial is winding down, loyalty rallies are also being held across the country, right? And so the plotters, the trial was actually openly discussed at these rallies, and the plotters were being condemned by party leaders, as well. Everyone from the president downwards were talking about how the plot would never have a chance of success. It was obvious that where this case was going, they were going to be convicted, and then they would cap it all off with a reaffirmation of loyalty and confidence in the president. So by the end of the trial, there really wasn't any surprise when Mutiso and the other conspirators were convicted. But to what extent was common knowledge actually generated within the ruling party about the rules of political order? And so to get at this, I was very fortunate to be able to get the actual transcripts of the parliamentary debates in the days leading up to the trial, during the trial, and immediately following the trial. And what these parliamentary debates show is really striking, because you can see sort of the tone of debate among these ruling party members shift over the course of the trial. And what you see by the end of the trial is the suppression of any form of dissent on the floor of parliament. Nobody's basically willing to say anything critical about the trial, about Kenyatta. And I'm about to show you a couple of different excerpts from these proceedings. I had to really restrain myself from showing you too many quotes, because it is really striking to see how these dynamics unfolded in these transcripts. So here we have, these were from a series of statements from members of parliament who were affirming their loyalty to the president. And they're actually specifically commenting on the case as it's unfolding. So here we have one member say, "I'm very much surprised to find that there's some people who are trying to disrupt this motion and are attempting to be sympathetic to criminals, people who are trying to destroy this house." And what's really intriguing about these transcripts, these Hansards, is that they include interjections from the audience, right? Anonymous interjections. So, as soon as this person made the statement, we hear, "They should get no sympathy at all." And then we have someone else from the crowd shout, "Hear, hear." And then finally, to sort of cap off this debate, this is actually a statement from the then Vice President Moy. And so he adds this sort of chilling undertone to the tenor of this conversation, where he says, "I would like to tell honorable members in this House that passing information by word of mouth could be subversive and could lead someone to the garden path without knowing. We should guard our tongues." right? And so these statements, right, so to hear members of parliament be so explicit about what are the acceptable terms of debate, to see members of the crowd, cheer on and support these sentiments, I found this to be a pretty compelling evidence that people were not willing to say anything critical about the president as this trial was coming to a close. I'm just going to show you a couple more quotes, I swear, and then I'll move on. But there were so many statements in these transcripts comparing Kenyatta to Jesus Christ. So here we have, we condemn them like God condemned Lucifer in heaven. A coup d'etat failed in heaven, and it has failed in Kenya. And it will fail again because the people do not want a coup d'etat, right? And then I just had to include this final quote. So those loyalty rallies that I just mentioned on the previous slide. So there was actually a member of parliament who commented on the size of the rallies, and he says, the Mammoth rally was attended by 2 million people. Tell me of any other country that has ever organized a rally which was attended by even half that number, right? So, rally size comments aside, I actually had, I found a document in the British archives that actually commented on this rally as it was happening. And by British estimates, the rally did not exceed more than 60,000 people, right? So, we can dispute this number, but I just wanted to say, autocrats inflating rally size seems to be a perennial theme. So now I want to move on to my research design. I want to show you some broader cross-national trends, who actually goes to trial. So to generalize these findings, I selected cases of coup plotters in post-independence British Africa. So specifically 1957 through 1994. Why am I focusing on individual coup plotters? So these are contests over power, right? These are fundamental conflicts in autocratic regimes. They were called coup plots by contemporaries, right? We might refer to these cases as rebellion today. And these plots were also often announced by the regime, right? So even if the fact that these plots might have been, fabrications by these autocratic governments, they do reflect a real sense of insecurity, right? So what's important is not whether or not the plot itself was genuine, but that an individual had been targeted by the regime for repression. I'm focusing on post-independence British Africa because decolonization, the timing thereof, was pretty common for the cases under my consideration. They all had English common law legacies, so that ensured that I was able to control for judicial institutions and legal institutions in these contexts. There's also variation in civilian and military rule across this region, so it allowed me to see whether this strategy generalizes across different autocratic regime types. And then with this criteria, I focused on Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. So I just wanted to briefly to summarize some of the state of the existing data on coup plots in this region. So a lot of the existing data that we have on these types of conflicts come from newspaper and secondary sources. So basically scholars have looked through contemporary reporting to document cases of coup plots in African countries. Here we have data from the McGowan coup data set, which is a really often cited data set from coups in Africa. And on the right-hand side, we have a newer data set from the Klein Center. And this is a combination of newspapers that have been hand-coded and digitally scraped. But the thing about this data, which is it really has helped us understand these conflicts in comparative perspective, is that there's a lot of sparsity, right? So look at the example of Malawi. In this Malawi row, there's only one documented observation in either data set, but notice that they're two different cases, right? So this is the challenge of using this type of newspaper and secondary sources, right? We're not necessarily getting the full picture of these conspiracies as they were happening in real time. And so with this in mind, I wanted to collect more fine-grained data on coup plots. And so I created a database of individual coup plotters using more than 5,000 historical newspaper articles, but also using more than 4,500 British government archival documents. And so using these British archives, I was able to hand code 2,500 individuals, around 193 alleged plots between the time frame and the country geographic scope. And so just to give you a sampling of what this data actually looked like, this is like a typical document from the British archives. They're tracking these cases as they're happening in real time. And here, we have to sort of like read between the lines and find out, okay, so this is a party that may or may not be implicated. Here's some actors, and tracking dates and trying to track names, and sort of using this information to pull out and extract the names of relevant individuals who are implicated in these crimes. Right. So part of what was challenging about this process is triangulating these individual names and repression outcomes over potentially long periods of time. So here I was able to track, okay, that individual I found in the first document, here I had reference to him being tried by a military tribunal, right? In other cases, it was easier because they would spell out a full list of the individuals who were implicated. And here I just thought, for Kenyanists in the Zoom, this was an interesting example of an actual list of detainees. And here we see Raila Odinga's inclusion on this list. So I just wanted to highlight, here are the takeaways from these newspaper and secondary sources. And then when we add these British shadow archives to our analysis, right, we're able to actually collect more data points and more observations that can help us understand these repression trends in post-colonial Africa. Oh, whoops. Okay, so the advantages of this data collection approach is that it illustrates how historical events were publicized and unfolded in real time. Declassified British government documents can also reveal cases that weren't necessarily covered in the popular press. The issues with this data is that coverage may actually vary by the level of foreign investment or the size of the expatriate population, right? So we have to include country fixed effects in our analysis. And then also, we can't assume that interest in documenting repression is going to be constant across this entire period. And so to account for that, I add year fixed effects to my model. Just to provide a little bit more description about the data, most of these coup plots, which I'm focusing on, were relatively small, right? They only included a couple of individuals with each plot. So those larger cases, I ran separate analysis for them, like including them or excluding them, and they didn't substantially change the results. But this is also another reason why I'm focusing on individual plotters, because most of these cases in my data set are relatively small, including a few number of individuals. Okay, so the hypothesis I'm going to test here are insiders are more likely to receive a judicial strategy of repression than outsiders. The variables are going to be repression strategy, so whether or not a case went to trial. The challenger type is going to be the main independent variable. So I'm coding insiders as being members of the ruling party or the military, and outsiders are members of the opposition. I'm going to control for regime type, so whether the regime was military or civilian. And then I'm going to estimate this using a logistic regression using country and year fixed effects. And so just before I present those results, I wanted to show you the bivariate analysis, which just shows repression strategy by challenger type. And so without including any controls, right, we can see that outsiders were much more outsiders received an extrajudicial strategy of repression than insiders. So insiders were much more likely to receive a judicial strategy of repression. And so again, this is without including controls. But so when we include controls, so here the reference level is being a member of the opposition. So here we can see being a member of the military increases the likelihood that you get repressed in a court by almost 70%, right? And so for members of the ruling party, that's the effects is less significant, but it's also still larger than being a member of the opposition, right? So it's around 30. And so I also coded this a separate way because in these regimes, there's a lot of party switching. So someone who is a member of the opposition might be treated differently, like if they defected from the ruling party or if they were always a member of the original opposition. And so I find that being a defector from the ruling party, you are still less likely to go to trial than a member, than someone who had never been a member of the ruling party, right? So it doesn't matter whether or not you used to be an insider. Like once you formally defect from the ruling party, you're effectively treated as an outsider. How am I doing on time? Should I wrap it up or?
So we're at 3:45.
Mm-hmm.
So we have 45 minutes left. So we're kind of halfway through. So if you feel like it's useful to spend a little more time, that's not a problem. It's just cuts into the Q&A. So it's the ball's in your hands.
Okay. Well, so if the audience can bear with me for a couple more minutes, I can wrap this up pretty quickly, but I'll just finish up the slides. So I just wanted to very briefly touch upon maybe a couple of different alternative explanations for the trends that I just showed you. So maybe it was the case that there were international norms at play. So some might argue that African leaders were using courts in these contexts because they were really trying to conform to international standards, right? Or maybe it was the fact that, former British colonizers were pressuring them to use these institutions that they had left in place. So, but what I find when I look into the archival evidence is that a lot of these trials did not conform to international standards, and they were widely criticized at the time for violating due process, right? So by Amnesty International and the British government. And ultimately, the British government was reluctant to intervene in these trials because they didn't want to be seen as interfering in what they saw as internal sovereign African political disputes, right? Whether judicial or extrajudicial. The British did not want to be seen as interfering, right? And so they actually were trying to take a very hands-off approach to these cases. So here is a good example of that. So this is in Sierra Leone. There was a very controversial treason trial, which led to the death sentence of one of the implicated individuals. And so the British government was actually questioning whether or not they should do anything about this death sentence. And so ultimately, they came to the conclusion, we don't actually have a legal standing to intervene in this case, right? They actually say there's no doubt that Brigadier Bangura put himself at the head of the attempted coup, right? And so as such, it's difficult to make a strong humanitarian case for this individual. And if we try to do so, we risk giving the impression that we're interfering in a sovereign judicial process. And what's especially striking, because I think that there's this like expectation that human rights are, or groups like Amnesty International are playing a major role here. But time and again, I found in the archives that the British government was so tired of hearing Amnesty International trying to petition them to intervene in these cases, right? So here they're talking about how they really don't want to give the impression that they're endorsing Amnesty International over an African president, right? So in this case, President Moi. And so they conclude that because they don't want to be seen as taking the side of a humanitarian, it would probably be in Amnesty International's best interest to postpone their campaign until after, the British government could sort of smooth the waters. So, all right, I'm not going to go into detail about the remainder of the book, for the sake of time, but I just wanted to highlight the final chapter. The final empirical chapter is really about unpacking this notion of a cooperative judiciary. And so again, to revisit this question, I was asking, how did African autocrats actually design courts to ensure that the judiciary cooperated with their repressive agenda? And the most striking thing that I found in this analysis was the fact that most of the chief justices in post-colonial Africa tended to be British, white, male expatriates, right? And this is for decades after independence, right? So looking at Kenya, for example, so the orange bars represent expatriate justices and the blue bars represent indigenous African justices. And time and again, we see that, in the Kenyan case, they briefly had an African Chief Justice, a Kenyan, but then they went back to employing these expatriates for very long tenures, right? And so the question is, why were they employing these expatriates? Was this another legacy or holdover of colonial rule? What I actually find in this analysis was that African presidents were explicitly requesting expatriate justices, right? Even when they had the option of employing an indigenous African, many of them preferred the white Englishman. And I find that the reason why this was the case is because of that trade-off I highlighted before, right? So they wanted to use these professional institutionalized courts, but in order to do so, they lacked a local supply of indigenous Africans who were qualified to serve, but could also be trusted to run the courts in a way that would have served the autocrats' interests. And so I show in this chapter why these white expatriates were a lot more compliant, why they were more easily controlled, and why they ultimately helped make more repressive courts in post-colonial Africa. All right, so just to wind things up, I want to highlight 3 contributions I see stemming from this book. So the first contribution is it broadens our understanding of the ways in which autocratic power is institutionalized, specifically its disciplinary dimensions. The second contribution is rethinking repression as both an extrajudicial and judicial phenomenon. And then the third contribution I think the book is making is questioning the normative assumptions about the judiciary and whom it actually serves. And just to conclude, I've laid out a theory of judicial repression. So number 1, a political trial institutionalizes the process of punishment and reinforces the rules of political order. The strategy is more useful when autocrats face threats to regime cohesion and must restore obedience to their authority. And then finally, I argue that professionalizing the bench helps institutionalize the judicial process, but risks making a judiciary less cooperative with the autocrats' agenda. And so with that, I will conclude, and thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Do you stop sharing?
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Fiona. Terrific talk. It's great to see how the project has evolved, and we've got a good series of questions that are rolling in. A lot of them are on the insider-outsider distinction. But I'm going to start off by asking some of my own, if I can. So one thing that struck me in listening to the talk is, so it's very much positioned within the kind of autocratic consolidation literature, kind of very much with threats and responses. But there's also a way in which it echoes from me the transitology literature and the literature on elite splits. And so one thing I've kind of found in the book I'm working on is that, it's not that when splits happen that this is when a regime collapses, as the kind of transitions literature thought, that when a split happens in the regime, the split needs to be repaired. And so I don't think we know enough about how one repairs splits in regimes and therefore to avoid transitions. So it might be worth sort of thinking about it in that light as you think about not only speaking to the kind of Svolic, there are 2 kinds of threats, but just kind of tie it to that, and then think about how this features in the regime's durability. I mean, do we see cases where regimes do have transitions because they don't resolve splits, maybe because they don't have these kind of judicial implements at their disposal? But the main question that I have is about, so in thinking about this through military regimes, which is where I usually see this happening in Southeast Asia, I was sort of wondering to what extent you're telling a sort of interchangeable institution story or a specifically judicial story. Okay, so this I think also comes up in Svolic's book, right? There are times where, well, co-optation of party versus military might be different. So our military is different, our judiciary is different, our bureaucracy is different. I know May Hassan is here. She talks about the way that the civil service can be used, not just for concessions, but also certainly to impose consequences at times. So I sort of wonder if to what degree you want to tell an interchangeable institution story versus a distinctive judiciary story?
That's a great question. Yeah, part of the motivation I have for this project is reading all of those works about those other contexts where these institutions are, May Hassan's work on the bureaucracy, Rory Truex's work on the bureaucracy, and like parties and militaries, like a lot of these dynamics, I've tried to think about how they translate to the judiciary. And I think there is a lot of overlap there, right? And so thinking about judicial rituals is kind of like thinking about other rituals of power that you see in autocratic contexts. There are common themes, but I do think there is something unique about the court itself. And I think part of that is because it is invoking these rational legal ideals, right? And so like the fact that it is conducted in the language of the law, right? And it kind of goes back to like Judith Schlarth's like comment, right? Oh, it's a political purge with judicial frosting, right? But it's like, so what is special about that judicial frosting? Maybe I should stop with the cake metaphor because it's like not very appetizing, but yeah, I think there's something about the language of the law and especially specifically criminal justice, which makes the dynamics of how this is performed worthy of study and distinct from these other fora.
Okay, great. So we actually have kind of a sort of nicely overlapping set of questions here from, on the one hand, from Natalia Forat, who of course you know very well, former postdoc, but now associate here at WCED, and Matthew Sabul, who is a current postdoc at WCED. And so intriguingly, Matthew asks the Russia question and Natalia asks the general theoretical question. So Natalia asks, why not use trials for both insiders and outsiders if trials increase obedience? Are there any downsides of using courts? And Matthew, in very related fashion, asks, what about Navalny? His case challenges this narrative in a few ways. He gets a trial, even though he's in the opposition, and the trial seems to have backfired, i.e. the ceremony of justice is clearly a charade. So it's neither clear to me that courts are reserved for insider, quote unquote, serious threats, or that they're more effective at managing those threats than extrajudicial coercion would be.
Yeah. So I've been following the Navalny case very closely, right? And I actually think that prosecution draws a lot of parallels with the prosecution of Nelson Mandela for treason by the ANC, right? And so, I mean, this is the main danger of a judicial strategy, right? Like you're trying to create a very simple narrative of someone has done wrong and they're going to be justly punished for it. But like with Mandela's case and what we're seeing happen right now with Navalny is that if you bring someone, who is, an opposition firebrand and you bring them to the court, they could use that as a platform for their own message. They could refuse to submit to the charges for which they stand accused, which is what Mandela did. And I think with Navalny's case, I think when he was formally being indicted, he asked for a pickle recipe. Like he's really trying to turn this trial into, a charade. That is the main cost, right? And so this is why it is a costly strategy if you can't control the way that the narrative is portrayed. And so with that in mind, that's why, if you don't have to use a judicial strategy, you shouldn't, right? And so that's why I think it's like with the opposition, there are a lot of like proven ways of dealing with and, eliminating and evicting them from the political scene where you don't have to go through this judicial fanfare. And so that's one thing that I attempt to tease out and unpack in the book in more detail. But yeah, it's a very excellent point.
Yeah, that's great. And so that actually reminds me of part of the point I wanted to make about the military analogy, which is that the way, and also from the transitions literature, the way in which you're saying there's this risk to professionalizing the judiciary is exactly the point that people make about the military as well, right? A more patrimonial controlled, military versus a more professional one. So there's an interesting way in which your story is both very cross-institutional and general, but then also specific. And that's kind of an interesting tension to kind of resolve as you go forward or play with as you go forward. So sticking with the insider-outsider dimension, Peter Carroll asks some questions on some coding questions. So you mentioned that insiders can become considered outsiders quickly when they betray the ruling party. This sounds a little bit like Malaysia to me too with the Anwar Ibrahim case. So how do you deal with that in the coding of your variables when this happens?
Yeah. So I tried to code things several ways. Didn't have time to show all the different analyses, but so the main results, I just coded the status of the challenger at the time that they were prosecuted, right? So whether they were a member of the ruling party, opposition, and then I coded it a separate way, right? So regardless of what their current status was, whether they were originally a member of the ruling party or the opposition, how were they subsequently treated? At the end of the day, like, I could have like kept like, how you slice the time dimensions, because there's like party switching, like there are so many infinite ways of doing that. Like those are the two ones that I focused on in my main analysis. But I did try to do some qualitative, tracking of some of these individuals and see how they were subsequently treated. And so I think there's like an example in Zambia of, former member of the ruling party who was ultimately had a huge falling from grace and, basically like victimized and humiliated through primarily extrajudicial means. But yeah, so those were the main two ways that I tried to think about these things in a temporal fashion. But yeah, this is one of the challenges of studying post-colonial Africa, like right after independence, when like partisanship is so unstable and volatile. It's hard to track down those demographics.
Okay, terrific. All right, so, and again, I'm going to try to cluster questions a little bit here. So we've got a couple of questions that focus on the colonial legacy part of the story here. And as you're speaking about, this is a particular context, we're right out of independence. And so both a couple of our WCED fellows with questions here. So first, Jundai Liu says, Fiona, thanks for the wonderful talk. If we conceive of British colonial rule and the judiciary system as a toolkit rather than international norms, can we provide an alternative explanation about institutional efficiency and constraints and how resources were distributed as historical legacies? And this sort of connects to a question that Adam Casey from WCED also asked, who says, thanks for a fascinating talk. I'm curious about what role is played by the origins of judicial institutions, particularly when they are inherited as opposed to regime-created judiciaries. How much does this depend on what you inherit from another regime or colonial era? Are you more likely to see judicial pushback when the judiciary was not created by the regime, and in turn less likely to pursue judicial strategies of repression?
Yeah, this is something I've grappled with for a long time, like the legacy versus legacy versus institutional choice. At the end of the day, like, yeah, these are former British colonies, right? They adhere to common law institutions because they were once ruled by the British. I do think that sometimes that narrative is sort of overemphasized. Because again, like at that moment of independence, there was actually a lot of debate. Like we look at it after the fact and think, of course, that was the natural outcome. But there was considerable debate, even on the British side, of whether or not they should actually allow these colonial institutions to stay in place, right? Because the British also thought there was like a reputational cost to having, Indigenous Africans use their institutions not in the way the British wanted them to. So they actually were suggesting to some African presidents, why don't you go back to customary law? And these Indigenous African presidents were saying, no, like we want to be respected and honored on the global stage. And so we're choosing to uphold these institutions. And I think that's the key, right? Like given the choice, African autocrats were making deliberate choices about which institutional legacies they were going to keep and which ones they were going to toss out. So, they got rid of the native courts, which the British had installed, but they streamlined it under the common law, right? They got rid of laws that constrained their authority, but they uphold the preventive detention and emergency legislation orders because those tools had been used to repress them during the colonial era. And so they then used those tools to repress their opponents after independence. So yeah, maybe that gets to Jundai's point about this toolkit. Like it was a toolkit and they specifically chose which weapons to take out of that toolkit and use against their opponents.
Okay, terrific. So we've talked a little bit about the risks involved in this strategy, right? So we're talking a bit about the courts could be, independent, some of these things could blow up in the regime's face. We have a question from Sherman Tai, which poses another possible danger of this strategy. So Sherman says that you mentioned one of the functions of courts in autocracies is that the general public who observes the judiciary ritual may share others' agreement of the verdict, thus reinforcing its legitimacy. but does this not depend on the public actually agreeing with the court, especially in cases like coups or riots where the opinion might be extremely controversial? So how do dictators manage this risk that is posed by a trial?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is something I'm trying to sort of figure out in the remainder of the book about how this strategy actually adapts in a more pluralistic media environment, where there are more voices and competing narratives about how we should interpret these events. And I think it might have been easier to control how the public received this message in the post-colonial period, partially because there are just fewer media channels. The state is kind of controlling, the state's controlling the press. They're controlling what information is received and how. In the case study that I highlighted, what I was attempting to show by highlighting the loyalty rallies alongside the parliamentary transcripts is that the state was taking deliberate effort, like while the trial is happening in court, because not everybody can attend the trial, right? They're holding rallies, these loyalty rallies, where they're just like repeating the message, the story that's being propounded in court, but they're translating it to a lay audience, right? So they're not using like formal legalistic language, but they're talking about the criminals in terms that, an everyday Kenyan can actually understand. And I think that the loyalty rally is also itself a kind of ritual, because it has that notion of you have a crowd, everybody's watching everything at the same time, but they're also watching each other, right? And so nobody wants to be that one person in the crowd raising their hand saying like, this is BS. Because actually the people who did that, there were cases of people who like criticized these rallies as like a farce. They were subsequently arrested, right, and prosecuted for subversive thoughts and seditious behavior. So yeah, this is like it's taking that idea of it, and maybe that goes back to one of your original questions about like, is this a judicial phenomenon, or is this like a broader, like, yeah, this is, the themes here do generalize across these other fora.
Okay, terrific. Now let's try to move a little bit outside of the authoritarian context, potentially. So Jeremy Boo, it was sort of said, thanks for the presentation, and he thought the Kenyan case was persuasive, but he's wondering whether the theory is specific to certain regimes or conditions, or whether it's more universal. And so he's thinking here of Singapore and even democratic Japan, where the judiciary is highly professional, yet rarely, if ever, rules against the incumbent party. And the court in these countries is often used to subjugate threats outside the incumbent party instead of within. So how do we think about these cases where, it seems like in a lot of cases, the judiciary is a very conservative institution, pro-incumbent institution, but might not require these sort of autocratic, backing to it, or this kind of autocratic strategizing behind it. So I wonder if that's kind of a different world of judicial politics, or is there something to be said for that being comparable in some way?
Yeah, I think Jeremy raises a really important point. This is actually something that Tamir Mustafa has written about, and sort of like lamented the fact that the way that this literature has developed, it really has been bifurcated between like scholars of autocratic courts and scholars of democratic courts. And I think that he wrote this article maybe like 6 years ago at this point, but there still hasn't been like that much synergy across like these two dimensions. And I think that is unfortunate, because it's sort of like their themes of these prosecutions. Like, we can have political trials in democracies. Like, it's not a purely autocratic phenomenon. Like, I think it's more, I say idealized in the sense like it's a pure type, right? Like we see them most starkly in autocratic context, because that's where we see like political leaders have greater ability and wherewithal to interfere in the process. But we see these cases unfolding in, as he says, like in Japan. We see, courts which are seen as partisan. In this country, right? Like, we have political trials in this country as well, right? And we can talk about like contemporary cases, but we can also, go back to the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, right? So like, and even the McCarthy Red Scare, right? That was a very ritualistic designed, persecution of people for their political beliefs. And this is something that is not something that we should just expect to see in a military dictatorship in post-colonial Africa.
Okay, terrific. So let's stick with this question of political trials. and kind of how useful they can be for different kinds of actors. So we've already said, okay, well, might not just be authoritarian regimes, might be democracies. But also, so the idea of a political trial in part is to reinforce cohesion, right, after a split. So we have this interesting question from Harun Erchan, who asks whether there are any cases where political trials are used by the opposition to bolster the resistance against autocratic rule. And actually, the example that comes to mind for me here is like the FLN in Algeria, right? So it's kind of thing when you have these splits within the resistance movement, that what you might do is try to bring the opposition together, the movement together, reinforce the movement through some kind of visible political trial of splitists and the like. Now, the example that Harun gives here is that since the breakdown of democracy in Turkey, it's not the coup plotters, but outsider rivals, the pro-democracy opposition, that have been using political trials to mobilize the opposition against authoritarianism. So could you imagine it being used in that context as well? So again, to kind of consolidate cohesion for not even a regime, but a group that would like to be the regime, that would like to seize power.
Oh yeah, sure. I think this is kind of reminds me of like the lustration stuff, right? I think it's the dynamics are slightly different because I mean that's talking about like prosecuting an ousted regime versus prosecuting a regime that sort of seems to be losing its grip on power. I will admit I'm not as familiar with that particular case, but this is something that I'm thinking about how to like round out the book by thinking about how it does generalize to these broader contexts, but also like more contemporary spaces. And maybe this is precisely the type of, we're living in a more, I don't want to say like more democratic landscape, but we're living in a landscape where it's like more conceivable for other actors, like opposition actors, to co-opt these tools for their own objectives. And so I think that I would argue that the logic does apply. Whether it applies to this particular case, I think the Turkish case is really fascinating, but I know it's like a very complex, multifaceted prosecution that is like also indicting someone who's like not even in Turkey. It's a bit of a mess, but I guess the judicial process is trying to simplify that. So.
Okay, so we have a couple of more questions. So if others have questions still to ask, we've still got some time. So others should feel free to jump to the Q&A. It's not too late. So let's start with a question from Alfred Momodou. All right, so and Alfred is proposing a maybe a little bit different international explanation for this, not the norms explanation. But so Alfred says that you make a good case that this is not international norms, international pressure. And although these political trials lack due process, they gave rhetorical cover to autocratic regimes at international institutions, and they allowed foreign powers to argue that the trials were sovereign judicial matters. So why is this not a better explanation than the insider-outsider theory? Right. So I think the idea here is that if you're the foreign patron, that this allows you to sort of say, well, isn't us. This is being done by the local sub. They're fully self-determining. They're not our puppets. They have their own institutions, and this is an internal matter, and we're not interfering.
Well, so I guess this is an argument about who was the intended audience of these cases, right? So I think if this was an argument that it really was for the British, that they were doing like any sort of repression, like in or out of court, then yeah, I think this does make sense. But I guess I'm not convinced that these African heads of state were deciding how to prosecute someone who betrayed them personally, like within the regime, that they wanted to do this for a British audience. And one of the things that really came out of the British archival documents was like you would actually find these transcripts of like or summaries of conversations between representatives of the African government and members of the British High Commission. And it's pretty clear that like it's really not about appeasing this like British High Commissioner or the British representative. Like the British is just sort of like trying to like scope out intelligence and just figure out what's going on, and they're just like getting snippets of information from these African leaders. I think that the way that these trials were performed, the way that they were reported in the local press, I think it was really more about domestic audiences. And so that would lead me to think it's more about these insider-outsider dynamics than international appeasement.
Yeah, I almost wonder though if we could try to put together this kind of question with the earlier questions about colonial legacies. So it doesn't have to be in terms of an audience, but it could also be something where this is kind of like how the relationship is shored up over time, that there's something that there is a diplomatic, and it'd be just interesting to look at the international politics of it. Like what's the diplomatic politics of, we gave you the gift of civilization through colonizing you, and then we gave you all these great institutions, and you really need to, you should use these great institutions that we left you, and you should show that you still like, and if you want to stay part of, like, to be, closer to the Queen in the Commonwealth photos, or, just that there's a certain status, maybe an international status that comes with it or something like that. You can imagine a different set of mechanisms through which the international might matter, other than it just being, it's for this audience, not that audience, perhaps.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think there's like one of the threads I was trying to follow and trying to figure out like the British angle in all of this was the role that the British government was playing in sort of like training, sending these overseas legal and judicial training programs and sort of helping to finance that, like during the post-colonial era. And I think it is, I'm oversimplifying, but like, as you point out, it's a more complicated story about the British saying, if we leave these institutions, like we want you to use them well, like we want you to maintain the integrity of the common law. And part of that effort was they created a pool of Commonwealth judges who were employed across the former British Empire, like across Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, like they were sending them everywhere. And yeah, I think the British role in post-colonial African development in these cases is really fascinating. And I think more research needs to be explicitly focused on that. Yeah.
Okay, great. We have a really interesting question from Irene Morse in the political science department, which I'm not sure if it's directly answerable within your framework, but so she says she's curious about the use of the term terrorism as a catch-all charge for political dissidents. So this seems to happen all over the world, even in democracies, certainly even in democracies, that's for sure. So what about this charge do you think makes it uniquely suited to obtaining convictions? And so Irene is thinking less about the public opinion or fear aspect of it and more about the actual judicial process and what judges are evaluating when they see a terrorism charge. So is this something that ever came up in any of the cases you've looked at, like where something crosses that line, and the language, I would think, would be more for outsiders than insiders, although maybe not. So what about the terrorism?
Oh yeah. No, this is a great question. Thank you, Irene. But yeah, this is the types of crimes that people are accused of. Like it is significant, right? So in the case that I showed you in the case study, they were charged with sedition, right? Because they didn't actually want to charge the plotters with treason because they were worried that might freak people out. Right. So they thought sedition would be like have less impact, even though they were still accusing these people of plotting to assassinate the president, but they were ultimately only charged with sedition. Terrorism, I think that's like, it's a very, it's a category of crime that really feeds into this narrative of law and order and national security. And that was really important in a lot of these post-colonial regimes because they really wanted to establish a sense of national identity, which again is like couldn't be taken for granted right in that post-colonial moment. And it's interesting in the Kenyan case too. They didn't formally accuse the opposition of being a terrorist organization until like years. It was incremental, right? Like they first called them like they were an illegal organization. They were illegally demonstrating. They were anti-democratic. But then the final straw was like, by calling them a terrorist group, they effectively could shut down the whole party. That was really like the last straw. But I do think that in today's day and age, I actually think that terrorism is not the most commonly invoked criminal charge. I actually think it's corruption. So a lot of like high standing political figures will have their political careers tanked because they get wrapped up in these corruption cases, which go to trial, they're publicly humiliated, and then they have no political future. And I don't know if that's like part of like a broader, like, broader global shift and interest in corruption cases. But yeah, I think corruption and terrorism, I think, are really two interesting categories of crime.
Yeah, that's really interesting too, because so much of all the massive protests we're seeing around the world, right? I mean, just huge, in democracies and authoritarian regimes, just huge protests, and corruption is just so often at the heart of them,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not hard to make people believe that a politician is corrupt, right?
Yeah.
You claim they're a terrorist, and they might say, well, that seems like kind of far-fetched. But if you say they're corrupt,
yeah, everyone's corrupt. Yeah, exactly.
And again, it speaks to this sort of the kind of cynical lowest common denominator authoritarianism we see, right? In which it's, someone like Putin doesn't need to prove that he's an angel. He just needs to prove that, Navalny is not, that there are no angels, right? So if there's no angels in politics at all, then you kind of could just, mess up the whole thing. So
exactly.
I think that's worth looking into. So that actually kind of speaks to Ann Pitcher asked a question here where, and again, I think as a really general point, I think it's just worth you thinking about like how much the things you're talking about are about the content of what you're talking about as opposed to the form, right? And so to what degree these are kind of generic kind of governance features or rituals, and to what degree, no, the content really, really matters. So for instance, corruption, terrorism, what have you. So Anne asks about the nature of the accusation and the nature of the accused. So again, I would think of these as ways of adding content. And does the content here matter? So she asked, were there other high-profile trials in these countries that led to convictions of insiders, but they were not treason trials? So that's the question of the accusation. And then in terms of the accused, she says it's likely there are a number of cases where defendants were accused of treason, but in reality, we're only trying to get the regime to open up. So are there cases where the accused then uses the trial to get the regime to do exactly that? And she uses the example of Angola to say where this hunger strike actually did force the regime to deliver lighter sentences and to reduce extrajudicial arrests. So what about those features of the accusation and the accused?
Yeah, that's a really important point. So, I mean, the example I just cited, it was like they specifically didn't go for we can mince words about sedition versus treason, about, are they really that different? But I do think that most of these cases, there was some tinge of treason. Like they always pay like lip service to treason because that was like the ultimate act of disloyalty to the sovereign. But I think over time, like the content of these criminal cases is changing. I think that's like, especially since the 1990s, which that's sort of where my analysis stops. But I think 1990s onwards, the fact that we see corruption increasing. Yeah, now I'm wondering, like, maybe this is where the research should be headed in the future. With respect to the second point, that's a really interesting point about the Angolan case. So using what happens in these trials as sort of a way of like liberalizing the regime. I actually think something similar might have happened in Uganda in the 1980s. So after Idi Amin was gone, I think the courts did become a site for victims of the Idi Amin regime to actually petition the state for the crimes that they had suffered. Under that repressive regime. So yeah, I think that's something that my theoretical framework didn't deal with directly, but I think that's the logical next step for how to build upon this. So that's a really great point. Thanks for raising it.
Okay, great. So I'm going to just go back to one question from earlier that Peter Carroll also asked from the political science department, and this goes to kind of just the kind of the basic unit of analysis here. And so he asks, so how do we know when we've seen a political trial? Specifically, we talk about criminal trials, we talk about different kinds here, right? So do we know that is there a ritual that also has substance? Or should we assume that when a trial is taking place in an autocratic setting, that it's automatically political, or that it's strategic in its ritual rather than? So like as you look at your data of just trials under authoritarian regimes, where is kind of the line between ritual and substance? Or is ritual something that gets added to substance? How do we think about that's? Got to be kind of like a tricky thing when you actually look into the heart of these cases.
Actually, yeah, Peter's now reminding me, like, this is why I focused on treason trials, because that is easy to like code as a political one. This is part of the reason why there's a lot of this is one of those contested concepts. What makes it a political trial? Do we focus on trials of the actors, right? Does it have to be a political actor? Because we see political actors being charged with like petty offenses all the time, right? And being harassed through judicial processes by those means. I think for conceptual clarity, I focused on like political crimes. That was a way for me to narrow my focus on political trials. But again, as I try to think about how these cases generalize to the modern era, right? So now we have, looking at political trials in democratic regimes versus autocratic regimes. I think this is something that needs to be revisited. I think it does need to think, we should think about like the ritualized nature of these processes, whether or not we expect the outcomes to go a certain way, whether we expect a conviction, right? Do we think this thing is rigged from the outset? Do we have political actors who are telling us to think that a certain outcome is due to arise? I think all of that, like it's part of the ritual, but for me, that's when I start suspecting like kind of smells like a political trial, right? So that's not like a very clearly conceptualized definition, but it is how I've been thinking about how this generalizes to the contemporary era.
Well, and it also has some analogies in elections too, right? So this question of are elections there to basically, and especially when elections are obviously fraudulent and there's blatant fraud and these enormous landslides and they're not credible, but they signal something, and so that these could be, kind of rituals of domination, right? Rituals of control in some ways. And so, one shouldn't overstate the degree to which these things are substitutes, but it's at least worth thinking about, to what degree regimes might be using different things. So those with a certain judicial, back to the legacy point, those with certain judicial inheritances might be more likely to use that kind of tool. Elections too, I think, are largely shaped by whether regimes, did the prior power, the colonial power, or was there a democracy before that held elections, right? That authoritarian regimes very, very often draw on the institutions that they're granted by history, and then try to just use them in the ways that they can. So thinking about those analogies is going to be really interesting, while still, I think, keeping the heart of it, because it is true that we haven't looked enough at the judiciary and these trials, and particularly not as a way of like providing rule of law or rule by law even, or like predictability for, investment or things like this. These kind of credible commitments of that, but to really show the disciplinary side of it. So I think the balancing act for you is to be able to both really show what's distinctive, bring a different kind of institution in, and these great narratives. I love the little speech bubbles. It reminds me how much you like cartoons, right? So it's like, exactly. We should see more speech bubbles in these, right? But by the same token, to also be able to speak to those broader debates and literatures on other kinds of institutions, and and you don't have to solve all these things yourself, but to open it up in ways that people can engage with it and say, oh, I see parallels in, when parliamentary commissions do this, an anti-corruption commission does this. Think about the different ways that those can work. It'll be really interesting to see.
No, those are all really good suggestions. Yeah.
Right. So how far along are we from? How close are you to submitting the manuscript? You still have a summer ahead of revisions, or what's the timeline?
So I feel very close. I think I'm going to try to submit it soon. Very soon.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Terrific. Well, keep in mind,
time is trapped. What?
Well, keep in mind, like, you will have time even after you submit it. You can keep working on it, right? Even if you get reviews, you will get to keep working on it. So don't you don't want to be like Charlton Heston's, like, white knuckles, like, but they're cold dead hands, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So,
okay, that's good to know. That's good to know. I feel
right. So if your knuckles are literally like losing all the blood in them, it might be time to
that just might be the pandemic fatigue.
It could also be that. That's right. It was great. Well, this is so fun to have you back.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Like, seriously, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to come back to the Weiser Center.
Well, we'll have to bring you back for real.
That would be lovely.
The book is together, and and so you're always part of the community. So it's great to have you. Great to have you with us. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and so just one last just brief announcement before we go. So the next event we've got, hopefully everyone will be able to come on March 9th. We're having this roundtable on reviving democracy globally and locally. And we're very lucky to have Michael McFall joining us from Stanford, and Hari Han joining us from Johns Hopkins. So that's gonna be a little bit more of an intimate two-person discussion, one with a lot of global experience, one who does great research on the kind of local manifestations of democracy. So I think that's gonna be a great discussion. So March 9th, 4 p.m., hopefully everyone can be here. So Fiona, thanks again. Keep in touch. and hope everyone stays safe and well. I think we actually have a wellness day coming up tomorrow. We have one of our wellness days of the semester. So everybody stay even more well tomorrow. So everybody take care, stay safe, stay healthy.